Awesome. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it to our Northeast Regional Advocacy Director for the Climate and Energy Program here at the Union of Concerned Scientists, Roger Stevenson. Over to you, Roger.
Thank you, Pallavi. And thanks everyone for making the time this evening. I'm delighted we've got Science Network members from all 6 New England states interested in the call today. We're here to learn about an assessment of state progress on resilience. 3 recent events serve to reinforce our thinking about state primacy regarding resilience. First, the bipartisan infrastructure bill provides for significant resources to states, local governments, and tribes to invest in equitable, climate-smart infrastructure. Second, the Supreme Court ruled that the EPA does not have authority under the Clean Air Act to shift electricity generation away from coal towards renewable energy. And third, the Inflation Reduction Act provides financial and technical support to state and local governments to develop bold and ambitious programs to meet the challenges ahead. All told, states will have a very significant role to play in both emissions reductions and mobilizing adaptation measures. Very pleased to have the Sustainability Fellows with us today to present their report, which you should have received by email this week. Please be aware of 2 things. First, tonight is an invitation-only event, and the report has not yet been made public. Please consider the report embargoed until further notice. Second, UCS does not support, endorse, or oppose any candidates or parties for public office, and we're prohibited from doing so. This report is an assessment of state progress. It is not an evaluation of policymakers or lawmakers. The Sustainability Fellowships are organized and managed by the UNH Sustainability Institute, and UCS was pleased to sponsor 2 summer fellows. The aim of this project was to review New England state climate action plans, as well as policies and legislation, and to assess whether they generate an adequate level of resilience that allows states to face the projected impacts of climate change. Moreover, the fellows employed the UCS framework and principles for science-based adaptation in their assessment, and I'll put a link to that in the chat. Let me introduce my colleagues and the fellows, all of whom will serve as facilitators later in the program. Dr. Cameron Wake is a research professor at the Institute for the Study of Earth, Oceans, and Space at the University of New Hampshire. Jake Roach is a senior outreach coordinator at UCS, working in both the climate and global security spaces. Pallavi Shrestha is a program associate in the Climate Energy Program and an integral member of the project team. And I'm pleased to introduce the 2 Sustainability Fellows. Jo Field is originally from Bristol, England, and she's pursuing her PhD in natural resources and environmental studies at the University of New Hampshire. Jo earned her master's in science communications from Cardiff University in Wales. Her graduate research now focuses on the roles of environmental stewardship and public participation in climate resilience. Miriam Israel is a dual degree student at the Fletcher School at Tufts University and the Harvard Divinity School, studying international environmental policy, human security, and the role of faith communities in combating climate change and creating effective climate policy. Miriam is a research assistant as well, analyzing climate commitments made by countries at the United Nations. So with that, I'd love to give the floor over to Jo and Miriam.
Thank you so much, Roger, and I'll share my screen. Okay, is everyone able to see this? Perfect. So just to start with, just to give a quick overview of the project that Miriam and I worked on this summer, the aim really was to review state climate action plans, policies, and legislation across the 6 New England states in order to identify resilience gaps, essentially gaps between the level of preparedness that these states need to develop in order to adequately cope with the effects of climate change and the level of resilience that they're actually currently developing. So in order to make this assessment, we used a combination of interviews and desk research. I will also say that Miriam and I both have a background in social sciences, so we really approached this project from that perspective. And so for the desk research, we were really looking at what exists on paper. So we were reviewing state climate action plans, which formed the main component of our analysis, as well as state policies, legislation, program, and other working groups. In terms of our interviews, we conducted 18 interviews with subject matter experts across the New England states. And our questions that we formulated for the interview were based on the Resilience Gap framework. Just an overview of the framework. It was developed by the Union of Concerned Scientists in 2016, really as a way for decision makers to consider their approach in developing and building climate resilience within their states. So we use these interviews and this desk research to inform our state-by-state analysis. For this, we assessed each state's climate action plan and everything else that they're doing against the 15 principles of the framework. This was an evidence-based approach based on all the materials that we gathered, which are included in our appendices of the report. And part of this process was really to not only assess what's happening within each of the states, but also to assess how the framework performs. This was kind of the first time of actually applying it to a real scenario.
All right, thank you so much, Jo. Good evening, everybody. So what you're looking at is basically a summary of the analysis that we did based on all of the work that Jo just described. So I know it's a lot to take in. Feel free to take a minute and just scan the chart. What you're looking at is, as I said, a summary of our analysis based on the framework principles in the UCS Resilience Gap framework. It summarizes all 6 New England states in terms of how well they align with the 15 Resilience Gap principles. So if you look on the left-hand side of the chart, you can see the 15 Resilience Gap framework principles sorted into 3 different categories, which are policy life cycle, long-term planning and policy revision, and equity and community needs. And then if you move across the chart, you can see that each state has 2 columns, which represent our analysis of both the climate action plans in each state and all the other policies, plans, and programs. That's the column that's titled Other. And states are ordered from left to right in terms of how well they align with the principles. So green means, yes, they align very well. Yellow is some, and red is no. And so you can see as you move from left to right that, it starts off mostly green, moves to more yellow, and then ends with some red. And some key takeaways, since this is a big chart, just some key takeaways to think about and highlights from our analysis are, first of all, there was a really wide variety between state climate action plans, both on paper and how well they are being implemented. Some prioritize only climate mitigation, others consider mitigation and adaptation, and they represent a real range in the amount of state leadership and political will to address climate change adequately. Some climate action plans have a whole of government approach, some are very sectoral and focused on economic gains, some are coming out of individual offices or agencies, and then some are even motivated by communities or local governments. And then an example of how you can sort of read this chart, I'll pull out a few principles that we found to be particularly relevant. If you look in the purple section, policy life cycle, the last principle is weed out existing maladaptation. This principle is one where there were gaps across the board. If you look across the chart, you can see it's entirely yellow with a little bit of red. And this is sort of demonstrating how none of the states in New England have fully considered the issue of maladaptation, either in their climate action plan or in their other policies and programs. This is a really important finding as funding for adaptation projects rapidly increases with federal legislation, more state prioritization of this issue, and the funding is rapidly increasing on state and national levels, and so the potential for maladaptation or general adverse effects as a result of climate projects is increasing. This is also important since one of our findings was that climate resilience implementation funds are mostly channeled through municipalities and not being mobilized at the state level. So there's a real potential for disparities in how climate resilient municipalities are able to become, given that some have more capacity to mobilize funds and implement projects, and that also could tie into the potential for maladaptation. And then one last thing to point out in this chart is the bottom section in the equity and community needs. This is a section that kind of across the board had a lot of gaps in the principles, which are the ones focused on inclusion and community engagement. All the states are making progress on this issue, but there definitely is a lot of room for improvement and more thorough implementation to make sure that communities are being fully included. So now we are going to go state by state and get in a little bit more in depth to some of these results. So we're just pulling out each column or each state from the big chart that you saw before. So some of the highlights from Maine. Maine is the furthest left on our chart, which means that it aligns the most with the framework principles, which you can tell by the high number of green boxes and then just a few yellows. Both the Climate Action Plan, Maine Won't Wait, and the other programs, legislation, and policies do a good job of identifying climate resilience needs and integrating both mitigation and adaptation. Most of the yellow in the chart is clustered in the equity and community needs section. This is not to say that Maine is not concerned about equity and inclusion, because of course we know that that's not true, but it's more a reflection of how the issue is not as well represented on paper. And a lot of our interviewees reported on the fact that a lot of inclusion work is taking place more informally, or it isn't yet public. So our analysis couldn't fully reflect the extent to which inclusion work is happening in the climate resiliency space. So our recommendation is for the state to better formalize these programs and better integrate them into ongoing work. In addition, Maine's rapid progress towards carbon neutrality, while admirable, could have adverse effects on marginalized communities in the form of rapid economic shifts, changes in government priorities, and the potential for vulnerable communities to get left behind in the energy transition particularly. And then current barriers to climate resilience in Maine include limited funding, a lack of specialized workforce, particularly in clean energy, and then federal and state level bureaucracy and resistance to change by state utilities. And we can go to the next state.
So the next state that we have is Vermont. In our analysis, we found that Vermont is a pretty recently emerging leader when it comes to acting on climate. They introduced several policies and plans and legislation to address climate resilience since 2020, which is when the Global Warming Solutions Act was signed in to the state legislature. And it's important to note that while we kind of focused our analysis here around the climate action plan for each state, this is only really one piece of the story in Vermont. So there's a lot of other policies going on, a lot happening in the state legislation and programs. So as you can see in the two columns there in our chart, there's some yellows under the state climate action plan, where there are greens happening elsewhere related to those same principles. The Global Warming Solutions Act encourages an integrated approach in terms of how mitigation and adaptation needs and efforts are being coordinated in state plans. In our analysis, we kind of felt that this really did reflect a systems thinking approach, as this was a gap that we did see elsewhere in other New England states. We also found that Vermont is implementing many of the recommendations that were outlined in the Climate Action Plan. The state budget for the next fiscal year includes $216 million for climate priorities, including both mitigation and adaptation efforts, which is a really great effort to see. But it's really worth pointing out that there has been a lot of public pressure, both from citizen groups and from advocacy groups, to really drive state government to act when it comes to climate. And then looking at the bottom of the chart here in terms of the principles that relate to equity and community needs, we found that Vermont is really aiming to center principles of equity and environmental justice in their approach to building climate resilience. But in our interviews and in some of our desk research, we found that there are concerns about how, in terms of implementation of these strategies, how these policies will actually serve the most vulnerable populations to the projected impacts of climate change.
Great. So next up, we have Massachusetts, which is an interesting case. I know a lot of you on the call tonight are from Mass, so particularly of interest, perhaps. And I will just caveat this one that our analysis of Massachusetts does not include the climate bill that was signed by the governor this August. So I think that that would definitely change some of our results, but this is, an analysis, as we mentioned, of a point in time over the summer. It does not include the most recent climate legislation. But I think Massachusetts is interesting because it has been such an early leader in climate action and was the first state in the region to have a Global Warming Solutions Act that did address climate change and the need to reduce carbon emissions. The Massachusetts Clean Energy and Climate Plan, which is the climate action plan for the state, is very strong on paper and shows a lot of ambition, but it has some gaps in its implementation, which I think is pretty clear. If you look at the chart, you can see a lot more green on the climate action plan side than on the other side. This is particularly true on issues of equity and community needs, and considering the cost of inaction and reflecting a long-term vision. These results are evident of the way that mitigation has been implemented as a state priority, but adaptation has often that's not always been the case, and it has often been motivated primarily by local advocacy. Funding for resilience projects is often channeled through municipalities, which again can make it difficult for low-income communities to access resources. Examples of this are the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program or the Coastal Resilience Grants, where despite being a really great program in its implementation, there have been barriers which have kind of made it difficult for vulnerable communities and maybe not entirely addressed the community needs of frontline or environmental justice communities. So in order to remain a leader in the region, Massachusetts does need to work on consistency in delivering on these types of programs, government transparency, and equitable implementation. And next up, Rhode Island. So again, a little bit of a mixed bag. Like Massachusetts, Rhode Island has been taking action on climate change for quite a long time. But one of the weaknesses we found in this work is that mitigation and adaptation efforts continue to remain very siloed, particularly in state agencies. And there's a bit of a lack of cohesive vision at the state level. So there's a lot happening sort of in the different sectors of the economy on specific issues, but they're not always, operating within the same sphere. This issue-based approach explains a lot of the yellow in our chart, particularly in the policy lifecycle section, because a lot of the state documents and policies that we looked at only address one issue at a time rather than taking more of a systems approach or trying to consider, across sectors. State agencies in Rhode Island have played a really important role, particularly the Office of Energy Resources, the Department of Environmental Management, and the Department of Transportation. But there are challenges in getting the issue prioritized in other agencies. And so progress can be slow, which is part of what you see in the long-term planning and policy revision section. It's difficult to plan long-term when there's a lot of negotiating between different state agencies. Rhode Island has a large focus on coastal adaptation and definitely is a leader in that issue, especially given its unique vulnerability and the extent of the coastline in Rhode Island. And so more attention does need to be given to maladaptation, particularly when thinking about ongoing development, population growth, and increasing infrastructure investment in the state. And then relative to others in the region, Rhode Island has been actually very successful in community outreach. It is a smaller state, so perhaps that's a bit of a bonus. But the state has prioritized inclusive processes when developing statewide plans, particularly the adaptation plan, and that's reflected in the equity and community needs section, where there is quite a bit of green there relative to the other states that we analyzed.
Great. So the next state that we have is Connecticut. This is a really interesting one. As you can see, there's a lot of variability in the chart. And in terms of how what the state is doing on climate relates to the framework's principles. We found that Connecticut kind of emerged as like a really early leader. They started introducing legislation to address climate mitigation needs really since 2004, but there have not been really any accountability or enforceability measures introduced. So the state is not currently on track to meet its mitigation targets for 2020, 2030, and 2050. In terms of adaptation, the state has expanded funding for resilience and adaptation projects, specifically through the Connecticut Green Bank. However, we found, and particularly this was the case in our interviews, we found that often development and infrastructure projects are taking priority over the resilience needs of communities. And it's also worth noting here that the Climate Action Plan for Connecticut is a phased approach. So at the time that we were doing this analysis, only the phase 1 report was actually published. The phase 1 report focuses specifically on short-term recommendations that were implementable in 2021 and 2022. And so what we're seeing right now is that the state is currently not reflecting a long-term vision. Of course, this might change when we see the phase 2 report, but at the time we did this, that was the case. So that's why you're kind of seeing some reds there for the principles in the middle that relate to long-term planning and policy revision. We found in terms of equity and community needs that equity and environmental justice really are at the core, certainly of the phase 1 report. There's a lot of emphasis around those, and that is translating into implementation. So, for example, the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection recently established an environmental justice program to help advise them on their planning processes. And also recently, the Connecticut Equity and Environmental Justice Advisory Group, CJAG it's shortened to, was established. And again, that's to advise DEEP on how they should kind of go about addressing issues surrounding equity and environmental justice in the state. We also found in the state legislation, there are efforts underway to really include communities in decision-making processes that affect them. So there are efforts underway to introduce measures for meaningful public participation around these processes, specifically in environmental justice communities. So this is really great to see. However, without that long-term vision and those accountability measures for both mitigation and adaptation efforts, it's unlikely that Connecticut will actually be able to achieve these equitable climate resilience targets that they're really striving for. Currently they are failing to protect communities from the projected impacts of climate change. And so this is something that we feel that the state would really need to work on in order to make sure that they actually follow through in terms of what's on paper. And then lastly, for our states, we have New Hampshire. In terms of how the state actions align with the principles of the framework, we found that New Hampshire aligned the least closely with them. The Climate Action Plan for the state of New Hampshire is the oldest one of the New England states. It was published in 2009, and its recommendations really have not been implemented. We felt that this was partly because of a lack of state leadership and will to implement the Climate Action Plan. But we also found, particularly in our interviews, as well as in our desk work, we found that there is a recognition among state agencies that New Hampshire's climate policies and approach to addressing the needs for climate resilience is different to the rest of the New England states, but this isn't necessarily being viewed as a bad thing. In terms of the Climate Action Plan itself, it definitely was developed using an evidence-based approach. Projections for sea level rise were considered. They featured economic cost-benefit analyses. However, this does not align with what the state is doing in terms of how it's acting on climate. We found that the state is not using a science-based approach. For example, it was the only New England state in our analyses that does not have legislation to try and steer the state away from a reliance on fossil fuels, despite the fact that within the Climate Action Plan itself, it notes the fact that we do need to steer away from fossil fuel consumption, you know, in terms of health and environmental, as well as economic implications. We did find that the state is considering climate impacts as they relate to sea level rise and coastal impacts. So for example, the Department of Environmental Services is required by the state legislation to update its projections for sea level rise every 5 years. And there have been several some policies and plans, specifically the Coastal Risk and Hazard Commission report, that have really been a driver of some of this emphasis. However, this is not consistent with how the state is considering resilience needs in terms of all other climate impacts that the state is projected to face. We found that the state really is focused on the economic costs of acting on climate rather than the benefits of action that span just beyond the economics of it. And we found that they aren't considering the cost of inaction. And this really has been acting as a barrier to both implementation of the climate action plan, but also in terms of introducing other robust climate plans and policies. And without this, this strong state leadership to address climate resilience needs, we found that a lot of the work that is happening within New Hampshire is really happening at the more local and regional level. Municipalities and regional planning commissions are playing a really important role in these efforts. And we are seeing that as a result of this, there are disparities between municipalities, between regions of the state, in terms of their capacity, in terms of the resources and the funding that they have available to act on these things. So in light of all of our state analyses, here are just some recommendations that we felt were pertinent across the states. It's worth, before I dive into these, I'll say that the analyses that we did conduct, of course, are happening at a very specific point in time. Even now, some of the, there have been new developments within some of the states that would have been great if we could have included them. They were not published or were not happening at the time that we did this analysis. We wrapped this up around the start of August. So it's worth us pointing out here that that some of this information might even now be updated, but it's particularly, thinking about the fact that we are in an election year and things are moving quite quickly, both at the state level and the federal level, that some of these things might not be relevant everywhere as things develop. And so it's just to dive into some of these recommendations. One is really the gaps that we identified in terms of how the states are acting in line with the 15 principles of the Resilience Gap Framework. These gaps really could be used to identify priority areas for future climate action in each state. This is both in terms of future research, looking at what states could be doing, and in terms of advocating and thinking about how we speak to the right people to act in the ways that we think that they should. We also recommended that the misalignment between mitigation and adaptation efforts that Miriam mentioned. We found that this was the case across each of the states. And so we'd recommend that folks within each of these states look to integrate and better coordinate efforts towards climate mitigation and adaptation. This is really important because both of these pieces are critical in order to build climate resilience in a way that is equitable. And I cannot stress that point enough. Another recommendation is that, we did find this mismatch between what is happening in terms of implementation versus what exists on paper. And so, we do strongly recommend monitoring how these policies and legislation are translating into implementation. And then again, just some of the points that Miriam mentioned earlier, considering opportunities for outreach and advocacy concerning maladaptation, as we found that that was a gap across the board. Again, that separation and siloing of adaptation and mitigation efforts and thinking about ways to coordinate those. and gaps in following through on equity, inclusion, and environmental justice. And overall, I just want to point out that when we did this project, we found that, despite a lack of strong federal leadership on climate, we did find that, there are many examples within these states that show really great examples of what can be done at the state level to kind of compensate for that lack of federal leadership. But of course, there are many examples of where states could be doing more and should be doing more. So this analysis here is really, really just kind of highlighting both of those issues. And I think that's certainly things can be taken forward with that. And just to go back, here's our kind of total findings if anyone's interested in looking at those now.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Miriam. We'll keep this table up for a while, and in a moment, we'll be asking attendees to respond to a few questions, but I would like to open up the floor, and if Jake or Pallavi can unmute folks, feel free to use the chat function, put an asterisk in there if you have a question, and we'll call on you. That way we can create a queue of people and keep everything on time and call on people as they go. So if you have a question, feel free to use the chat function and put an asterisk in there, and we'll call on you. Cam, you have a question.
I thought I'd get things rolling so other people can formulate their questions and put the asterisks in. Yep. Just Miriam and Joe, thank you so much for this sort of this big lift and really trying to, scan what the different New England states are doing. And I guess my question really comes with my hat on that I'm chair of the Kittery Climate Adaptation Committee. So we're working at a very local level to deal with adaptation. And you guys did focus at the state level. But I guess I was interested, and I hadn't thought about this question before, but it came to me as you were presenting, is that as you sort of talk to people in the interviews, and like you mentioned in New Hampshire, right, there seems to be lots of action at the municipal level, but not at the state level. I guess I want to ask you how much you feel you missed of that local to regional activity, which I understand was not a focus, but I'm sure people must have brought this up in the interviews. And it does seem to be ultimately, if we're really talking about adaptation and mitigation, it's going to happen at the very local level. So this is not like, hey, why didn't you include it? But more, how much do you think you missed? And then maybe that might be something of a recommendation in the future, which we'd probably need 2 fellows for every state to even make any inroads into that.
Miriam, do you want to start or shall I take it away?
Go ahead.
That's a great question, Cam. I will say that, in terms of our analysis, we had the kind of mixed approach of having our interviews as well as our desk research. We didn't include anything that was happening at the local level in our desk research. So we certainly missed a lot of what is happening on paper at the local level and at the regional level. In terms of our interviews, we were not specifically asking questions, again, about what's happening. It would just be mostly folks that we spoke to were bringing up examples of where state programs or state policies were being implemented, or there were examples of where the impacts of those could be shown at the local or the regional level. So to answer your question, I think we probably missed a lot because, like you said, that was not the scale at which we were looking. And I absolutely agree. I think, considering the fact that in a lot of the states, that work is happening at the more local level and it's not happening at the state level, it is a critical piece of this conversation around climate resilience and how resilient the New England states are becoming. I think it is a critical piece of that. So, you know, you could certainly do this whole project over, like you said, looking at each state and thinking about it at that level for sure.
Thank you. We have a question here from William Beckett. And William, you can ask it yourself if you'd like. Come off mute. I'd be curious to know what state you're from. I think I have it right here. Can you give some examples, specific examples of what you mean by maladaptation? And I think perhaps we can backfill some of that after your answers, Miriam and Joe.
Sure. Do you want us to go ahead and answer that now then? Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good question and a valid one, given that I think it's outstanding in a lot of states where there's not a clear kind of conception of what maladaptation is. Basically, in our research, we were using that term to refer to any instance where an adaptation project or sort of any project results in sort of reduced ability to cope with climate impact. So an example that kept coming up was if states are making investments in infrastructure like culverts, and they're not adequately taking into consideration climate projections for sea level rise and storm surge, then they're investing in culverts that are not going to be adequate for the projected impacts of climate change and will result probably in greater flooding. Another example is building new housing on existing floodplains, where even if the housing is meant to be climate resilient or energy efficient, or not have natural gas as the energy source, even if it's all these things, but you're building it on a floodplain, you're likely setting that whole investment up for future problems in the future. I just had another example that I'm forgetting right now, but I think those are, one that came up a lot in our interviews as well was the siting of solar farms. So where solar panels are going, if you have to, cut down old growth forests to make room for solar panels, that could also be an example of maladaptation. So it can really be a lot of things often related to infrastructure and like investing in development projects.
Great. Thank you. I'll toss another one in that mixes both mitigation and a changing climate, and that is the prevalence of people in northern counties, for example, in northern New England, the increased purchases of residential air conditioners. Residential air conditioners are more energy intensive than perhaps heat pumps or better insulation, obviously, and they'll use more energy, which is something that we're trying to avoid to do. So that's one example. David Reno has a suggestion, and that is you've suggested an Office of Scientific Services that would advise the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the City of Boston. Do you know of any such agency already in existence? Let me just jump in there and say that it appears it appears that most states in New England now have a climate office. Where that sits is different in each state, but I do know that there's a Massachusetts. There's a director of climate change and resilience in the EEA, and I can get you the person's contact information when we conclude here. Cam, you had another suggestion about maladaptation.
Yeah, I think this notion that residents should rely upon generators has proven to be fatally flawed, in that what we see from electric outages is more people dying prematurely from carbon monoxide poisoning than from anything related to the loss of electricity. There's certainly issues around being cold and losing food and significant issues around medical equipment that people need. But not using generators correctly, it turns out to be the biggest killer from power outages. And so it's on a much finer scale, but sort of another example of probably not a policy that we want to be pursuing or relying upon in the future. Building a more resilient grid is a much better idea.
Great, thank you. Hey, if we could stop sharing the screen and get everyone online, that would be terrific. And I see that David Larson has a question.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you even studied this, but I'm wondering if you saw any anecdotal correlation between term lengths for, say, senators and representatives in a state and their ability to focus on long-term solutions.
That was not part of this study, but I definitely think that's a good correlation and a good question. I think that especially right now, even in an election year with, you know, all the governors up for re-election, we were even seeing kind of the influence of that on maybe the speed at which, you know, administrations were willing to work, you know, in some cases faster, in some cases slower, depending on the political context. So I definitely think that it's important to consider what the, you know, electoral context is and how kind of forward-thinking administrations are willing to be.
I think just to add to that too, you know, we found, particularly in our interviews across the states, a lot of folks, you know, were very conscious of climate, and climate change is a really long and really slow process. And in order to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change, that, you know, spans way beyond election cycles. And so inherently, you know, for a lot of folks, they felt that elected officials often aren't willing to take meaningful climate action because it's not necessarily going to win them the next election. And I think that's particularly relevant given the year that we are in. I think, again, we weren't kind of specifically looking at this, but I wouldn't be surprised, you know, if we went back and we did dig through all of our notes, that, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if we did see a correlation between, you know, what states are doing this year and in terms of climate versus years where they're maybe kind of taking things a little bit slower and aren't thinking about the upcoming election.
Thank you. Thank you.
David, what state do you live in?
I'm in Rhode Island. You know, we have politics here. So.
Yeah, I do recall those days. Even what was the mayor's name in Rhode Island?
Buddy Cianci is who you're thinking of, I think.
Yes,
so.
yes. I got grilled by him when he had a radio program, and I remember him well. I think that was back in the days when even nuns were being arrested for corruption. Well, I must say how proud I am that UCS chose to sponsor these fellowships. You know, we're going to be using this information moving forward. We're going to use the report throughout the next months and into 2023. The report and the findings will be used and repurposed to foster discussions with state agencies, with climate offices, with advocates and community groups, and with legislators. And before we do that, I would like to invite you to enter your own opinions. If Pallavi, if you could share this Google Doc, or are we asking folks to go into the chat and opening it up themselves?
Yeah, so what we can do here is, I don't know if everyone can see, I just entered a link to a Google Docs on the chat. So this is just a list of all the states that we just spoke about and 3 questions that we want you to consider, and just like give, I think, 5 minutes worth of thought and just read the questions and input any comment that you can think of under the questions about your state and from what you've heard from the fellows' presentation tonight. And after 5 minutes or so, we can open it up to discussion and we can follow the same asterisks thing on the chat if you have any comment that you want to expand upon. And again, as you can see on the top of first of all, I want to make sure everyone can access it. Yeah, and I can also share my screen just to highlight the 3 questions that we want you to consider in terms of your, your state.
Yep, they are the questions are identical for each state, and we'd encourage you to represent your state, answer the questions. And if you wouldn't mind, please enter your initials after each of your comments.
Can you all see the 3 questions on the screen? Okay, great. If you have any questions about what we're doing, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask or enter it on the chat. Do we have anyone from Vermont tonight?
Thank you for those people who are putting your initials in there. That's very, very helpful. David, did you want to expand on your comment in the chat with respect to the UUs and the program they have on plastics? I'm not clear what's meant by the challenge.
Okay.
And who the OSS is.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. There was one of our groups at the First Church in Boston would be talking about the plastic pollution and how much we are simply throw plastic away and don't really think about it until it clogs everything. So we were making a point about that, trying to reduce plastic in everyday life, just in things like shopping, etc. But also the question of, even if we stopped it tomorrow, what are we going to do? Now, in England, they've stopped using plastic shopping bags, which I certainly agree with. That's one little example. Many times, unfortunately, we don't act so much as we react. We have a crisis and we react to it. And so what I would suggest would be an organization that would unite the scientists of Cambridge with the politics of City Hall, Boston City Halls, and also the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, so that if they came to a thing like flooding, we could have a liaison who would come and give them the word. When I was a student at Emerson College, one example, I was a reporter at WERS. I was given an assignment to do a program on the death penalty. They gave me a number to call. I spoke to a reporter in the Brookline Citizen. He said he would do the interview, but there was this other man at Tufts University, Hugo Anamado, who was the national authority on it. So I did an interview with him. There are many experts there, but I would like to build a bridge over the Longfellow Bridge between Cambridge and Beacon Hill. And I didn't know if anyone else had done that. I think we may have a climate thing, but climate is one of the many issues we have involved. So I think, while it's a very good idea, let us be inclusive of, but not exclusive to, climate. Yeah. So that's more of that in overgeneralization is my basic idea, and I would like to work with USC about it.
Sure. I'm glad you brought it up, because I have learned more and more about the concept of advanced recycling, because New Hampshire is one of the states where the American Chemical Society has succeeded in getting legislation to allow advanced recycling, not as a simple manufacturing facility, but to make a long story short, the carbon majors, like ExxonMobil, are the major producers of the raw material for plastics.
Right.
And plastics are essentially looked upon by the carbon majors as a significant off-ramp economically, in the event that CO2 reductions continue to ramp up, and emissions reductions, and they're forced to play their hand. So look for more information from UCS with respect to the concept of disinformation and climate, but also the same game plan is being used with respect to the concept of advanced recycling of plastics. Mm-hmm. And we're looking at this now. I've stepped up a little bit of advocacy here in New Hampshire, and more on that later. And I'd love to keep you involved, David.
Fine, I would like to. And while I have your, I don't know if you can see me or not.
Yeah, I can.
While I have you here, let me suggest to anyone who does not already know it, I sometimes feel like I'm from Pennsylvania. I feel like I'm sending coal to Pennsylvania or coal to Newcastle. For those who have not seen it or read the book, let me highly recommend the book and the documentary called Merchants of Doubt, about the mis- and disinformation campaign to confuse the public who may not be scientifically adept about, well, we're really not sure about this. This is a major propaganda effort, and this film should be shown at churches, at PTA meetings, and at churches to show that there is this huge disinformation propaganda campaign that is being waged by industry. And they have a lot of astroturf groups that, you know, say they're in favor of good, clean water. And it's like you're saying they're against sin. Let's get the information to the people who are the decision makers, and not only the politicians, but the mayors, and also the people who have influence in different organizations, churches, the Lions Club, the Elks, the Moose, the Masons, etc. You know the film?
I have not seen it, but it looks like Cam Wake is going to be showing it to his class, and Joe Field. There are a couple of people nodding their heads here.
Good.
The other,
my phone, giving information to people.
And, you know, 4 of the 6 New England states are suing fossil fuel companies.
Yes.
At the state level. Attorneys general are. And there's a distinction here in Massachusetts and in Connecticut. The attorneys general are suing fossil fuel companies not on climate damages, but on consumer fraud.
Yes.
And that's what's going to keep those lawsuits in state court. And that's, again, how these are connected. And I thank you for the opportunity to bring that up. Do you have any other comments or questions? And let me go into this document here. And if you feel free to keep on adding your comments and your answers to these questions. I'm looking at several of these here. These are very, these comments are really good. I really appreciate this. And someone would like to be more informed about heat pumps. And suggests that Maine might be better off investing in ground-based heat exchange systems. Would the person making that comment want to add more, because it's very interesting.
Yeah, that was me. I'm in Maine, and there's been a lot of attention given to heat pumps, and I see more and more advertising for heat pumps. You know, and I think the switch in home heating systems into electric systems to get away from fossil fuels is going to be a kind of a revolution when it comes, and it probably will come slowly in Maine. I'm just a little bit concerned that all of the attention that heat pumps are getting, and I wonder if the technology is really is going to really serve the needs of Maine people, where the temperature can and routinely gets below 15, minus 15 in the wintertime, where my understanding is that heat pumps.
If someone has a phone going, or is that yours, Robert?
I think it's mine.
Okay. All right. It's interesting too how states are making decisions on how to use federal dollars. There are differences across the states right now, and that's something we're going to have to be looking at very carefully in the next year, 2 or 3 or 4, and in the next decade. How are the states leveraging the Jobs Act dollars? How are they leveraging the IRA dollars? How are they moving that forward? And that's going to be that's going to necessitate a level of accountability and a level of monitoring at the state level that UCS really has to get, prepare for. I see a couple of hands raised, Cam and Joe.
So Robert, thanks for raising that point. Also a Maine resident. And I want to say, first of all, it's probably one of the few things that our Democratic governor and Republican wannabe governor agree on, is that heat pumps are actually a great solution for Maine. And but sort of moving from the politics to personal experience, we've had them in Kittery now for 5 years, and they work about, I want to say 90% of the time. And so we do have a backup boiler, but for most of the year they work, and they're really nice in summer because Kittery's, we have a problem with air conditioning in summer now too. And more recently, I'm renovating a large building up in Bethel, Maine, which isn't as cold as Aroostook County, but it's not far. And my electrician was really smart. He said, listen, just put in some really efficient baseboard electric. So on those 10 to 20 cold days, you can still draw from a clean grid. It's clean heat, but the rest of the time, the heat pumps have been working really well. And so we've had them for one winter, and they're very efficient. They're 100% efficient down to minus 17 degrees Celsius, the new stock. And then the efficiency does tip off, but it doesn't go to zero, right? And so I think if we have some backup heat, and even people that use a lot of oil now can keep those as that backup, and then really sort of have, 60 to 80% heating. And I'll say in this time with fossil fuels as risky and prices being uncertain, especially with what Russia and OPEC are doing, it's a really good solution for Maine residents, especially that rely much more on oil, to flatten out what it is they're going to have to pay for heating in winter. The fluctuation in oil prices is going to be very painful in Maine this winter.
Thanks. Joe, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, just this conversation around heat pumps in Maine. Just to circle back to our interviews, one of the things that we did here were, and we didn't explicitly look into this, and I don't know if there's really data out there to confirm this or not, but we did hear concerns about state funds and federal funds which are being used to incentivize heat pump installations, really those heat pumps being installed as a backup and not a primary source. That was a concern that did come up, and I think it would be really interesting to understand what that actually looked like. It looks like are more people kind of installing them as a backup, because of course up in Maine you definitely want to have your heat sorted in the winter, but are they being installed as more of a backup source, or are they being installed to replace more traditional heat sources? That was a concern and a question that came up, and I think folks might be interested in this conversation here.
David, do you have your hand up?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, Joe, I was trying to get you for a direct field. Did you say there is, I was reading your email here, you said, is there I know Merchants of Doubt, the book and the movie, is there a Triumph of Doubt that I do not know about? Is that a book or a film or both?
I don't know if it's a film, but it's a book. The same authors, it's kind of the follow-on from Merchants of Doubt. And if you've read it and you thoroughly enjoy Merchants of Doubt, and I would highly recommend it. Yep.
Thank you. I was unaware of that. For some reason, I couldn't write you directly, but I certainly would like to. That will probably be on my read list. Thank you for that information. This is exactly what I mean. The information, getting the right information to the right people. The word for that is called politics and lobbying. Thank you.
And I can see Cameron has put in the chat the link to it on Amazon.
My apologies for sending you an Amazon link, but you can at least read the background of the book there. You don't have to buy it there.
True. I'll buy it at the Harvard bookstore. Independent. Like me.
Well, we have any other questions for the fellows? As I mentioned, UCS will be leveraging their work well into 2023. And I want to look at your responses to the questions more closely. Pallavi and I will have that responsibility. The next part of this program be the poll question, because and we're going to ask folks to look at these polling questions as we leverage the report and work with states on these cross-cutting issues of maladaptation, of equity, on these cross-cutting issues of moving mitigation and adaptation from their separate silos and getting agencies to talk with one another. We're going to need your help. Voices are going to be key. I think one thing that Miriam and Joe did discover in their interviews of subject matter experts was this, the state, when they talked to someone, it seemed like movement was happening because citizens were getting involved. So we have a couple of questions here. If you can answer these for us, that would be terrific. And we'll end the poll in about 5 minutes. I guess. And I should say that folks who are co-hosting this webinar aren't allowed to fill this in for some reason. But that's, I went to the College of Low Technology. I can't tell you why that is.
Hey, Roger, while folks are answering that, I have another suggestion for UCS, and it's, again, I hadn't thought about this before tonight, but this question is raised for me, is the action up to addressing the risk? And, my sense is that the coastal states of Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut have way more risk, because I think that sea level rise is the existential threat. So even though Maine scores well in sort of, from the metrics of the UCS gap report, I would argue pretty seriously that we're not doing what we need to based on the enormity of our coastline. And so in the future, we might want to think in terms of evaluations of, doing the detailed work, but asking this bigger question: given the risk, is the effort large enough? Because the physical risk is not the same in every state.
No, you're right. And one of our analysts and people in our climate shop early on, as the fellows were about to come on board, our analysts were tinkering around with whether or not there was methodology to apply to the states to ascertain whether states were adapting to 1 foot of sea level rise, but mitigating all in a way that would really mean 2 feet of sea level rise, if you see what I mean. So, they're still working on that, but it's an excellent question. And the fact that we have to look at those questions in that light, because listen, our municipalities, our communities were built to last. I live in a town that's 300 years old. Kittery is almost as old, right? And the infrastructure there, ostensibly, should be around for the next generation. So we're going to have to look at it.
That's a really nice metric, though, what you're mitigating to for sea level rise and what you're adapting to. That's a really quick metric. You could do a nice map of coastal New England showing how we're adapting to about half of what the risk is.
That's right. Pallavi, is the poll closed?
No, it's still on.
Okay. Terrific. Well, I know that Pallavi and I will be able to capture this information, and we'll go through the questions and your responses to those questions tomorrow and early next week. We'd very much like to remain in touch with you as we move forward and build a class of members of our science network in each of the states who understand what the resilience gap is and how their state is working to narrow that resilience gap over the next 5 and 10 years. Unless there are other questions or comments, I see something in the chat here. Barbara Watts in Rhode Island. Barbara, would you like to voice this question and see if we can respond to it?
Well, yes. We have something called the EC4, which is all the state groups working together. And we had a scientific advisory committee that worked very hard on adaptation and sea level rise. It was kind of isolated from the mitigation group. So how can they better get together? What are examples of where this is being done? And what are you thinking of?
I think Terry Gray and Sean O'Rourke are two people working very closely on this issue in Rhode Island. And I should say that Rhode Island has an infrastructure, the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank that has been repurposed in some way to, in many ways, to be climate ready, if you will. Because the Resilient Rhode Island Act that created EC4 happened in 2014, there's now the Rhode Island the Rhode Island Act on Climate bill that enforces emissions targets. So there is the potential that act only passed in 2021, right? So there is that potential. But you bring up an excellent point, and what you see in Rhode Island is what we see across the states, and that is the siloing of these two initiatives, and that's going to be a project for everyone in the coming, perhaps in the next legislative session. And Cam, you have a comment to address with respect to Barbara's question.
Yeah, I think our preservation and even enhancement of coastal ecosystems, and especially salt marshes, but salt marshes and provide wonderful protection from storm surge, and anybody that has them knows this already, and they store enormous amounts of carbon. So we've talked about blue carbon, we've talked about green carbon, we talked about this teal carbon, which is at the interface. And probably most importantly, preserving land so that they can migrate inland as sea levels rise. It's going to be really, really critical. And it's for me, it's the classic mitigation adaptation strategy.
David, did you have your hand up?
Yes, I did. I'm a little confused by the question. They said, did you want to get the kit? And then it seemed like the second question had two separate questions. I'm interested in getting the kit. And it also then said, are you interested in working? It was also like one contradicted the other. I couldn't put in two things. So I'd like to know if somebody could explain that to me. I am interested in getting your kit so that I maybe do advocacy. Then the other questions seemed like they were both the same question.
Well, I think the hands-on coaching is a system within our science network, the function of the science network, to work one-on-one with small teams of science network members who can on their own independently work on some of these issues on a team-based. And I think if I'm not mistaken, you brought up plastics.
Yes.
And, perhaps there's an opportunity. This coaching is sort of issue blind, if you will. And perhaps we can talk about that offline. And
it's advocacy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. Now I got it.
Good. Well, seeing that it is 7:48, unless there are objections, I'll give you back 12 minutes of your time. And again, I want to extend my deep appreciation to Joe and to Miriam, to Cam Wake, their advisor, to Pallavi, who certainly has put a great deal of effort into the program since the very beginning in helping UCS mentor the fellows and put the program together. And I want to thank the members of our science network. Without you, without those UCS supporters and members with advanced degrees who raised their hand, we would not be the organization we are. Robert Capers, did you want to have the last word? Did you put your hand up? Oh, you're on mute.
That was, I was going for the reaction, just saying, good job. It was an interesting program. I enjoyed it very much. I think those are clapping hands. Maybe that's just to raise your hand. I'm not sure.
I don't know. Again.
Good job.
I'm a liberal arts guy. What do I know? Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. And we will be in touch.
Thanks all very much.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Roger and Pallavi. You guys have been great throughout on the UCS end. And thanks, Cam, as well, on the Sustainability Institute side of things. You've all been so helpful. And this project definitely would not have come to fruition without all your support.
Thank you. Yeah, what Joe said.
Thank you, everybody.
Great job, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Have a great rest of your night.
You too.
Bye-bye.